Welcome back to the afternoon session and a keynote speaker. I'm Alan Spalt from Toxic Free North Carolina in Carrboro, North Carolina, and a member of the board of Beyond Pesticides. It may be hard to remember, as we are here in the shadow of the Rockies, that there's some pretty spectacular country back east as well. Last fall, my wife Susan and I drove through West Virginia and stopped at Hawks Nest State Park. From an overlook, you can see about 5 miles up the New River. The New River is misnamed as it's one of the oldest rivers on the continent, and it has cut a very deep gorge. At the end, you can see a dam, not very big dam, and the entrance to a tunnel that's a mile long and angles down through the rock, through the mountain, carrying water to a hydroelectric dam that's down and catches the bend of the river as it goes around. This park has some sort of atypical historical signs. They mark the site of, not the usual thing you see in parks like this, the state's worst industrial accident, resulting in the deaths, according to the marker, of about 476 workers. We know from further reports that the toll was over 700. So what's that got to do with us here at a pesticide conference? Benjamin Ross, our speaker today, has spent decades researching and documenting the causes and culprits of pollution. His goal is to answer the question, a variation of Sam Ervin's Watergate questions. What did they know, and when did they know it? Hawks Nest was no accident. The workers died of silica poisoning. It was known before a spade was turned, years before, that silica dust caused lung cancer. Ross and his co-author Stephen Amter clearly document why Hawks Nest and many other disasters were not prevented. Why weren't they prevented? Indeed, were covered up in their concise and yet heavily documented book, The Polluters, The Making of Our Chemically Altered Environment, which is here on sale as well. You'll not be surprised that pesticides figure heavily in this industrial pollution. First arsenic, then DDT, and really many of our favorites are represented. Ross and Amter document what we have known to be true. The industry developed, perfected, and used intentional strategies to rebuff, divert, capture, and emasculate attempts to regulate pollutants for more than a century. Spill, study, and stall. Defending pollution is as American as apple pie. I'm honored to introduce Ben Ross. He's president of Disposal Safety Incorporated, an environmental scientist, a veteran of various committees of the National Academy of Sciences and of the EPA Science Advisory Board. He's played an important role in helping bring some polluters to justice. He has a lot to tell us. Please welcome Ben Ross.
It's a great pleasure to be here working with Beyond Pesticides, who we have been working with on and off for many years. And what I'd like to talk about today is really think about the fact that we now have more than 100 years' experience with industrial chemicals in our food supply. We have to start thinking, what lessons can we learn from that experience? Because over 100 years, there have been vast advances in science. But human nature and politics change much less. And there's a lot we can learn by looking back. And there's one overwhelming thing that I see looking back at this history, and that is that politics and economic pressure can distort science, but science has very strong and powerful ways of bringing the truth out in the end. And what often makes the difference of whether that's possible is pressure from the public. And I know the people here in this room are very important to that process. I'm going to go back and start with what was really the first time that industrial chemicals in food became a public issue. That was in England in 1900, when there was an epidemic of arsenic poisoning that killed 70 people from acute arsenic poisoning, and it was traced back to arsenic in the beer. In the beer. Mostly in Manchester and Liverpool, and generally the north of England. What happened, the cause of it was that England had at one time had a beer purity law like the one in Germany. But that was repealed in 1880 by William Ewart Gladstone. He wanted to raise the tax on beer, and the brewers had a strong lobby in Parliament. So he made a deal that they would let the tax increase go through in exchange for repeal of the beer purity law. The brewers started replacing barley with cheaper forms of starch and digesting it with sulfuric acid. And what caused the disaster was that the high-grade arsenic-free sulfuric acid ran short, and the brewers started getting the low-grade made from pyrite that was high in arsenic. When this happened, when the crisis hit, beer is very important to the English. And there was a Royal Commission of Inquiry set up, headed by Lord Kelvin, the famous scientist who had discovered the second law of thermodynamics and designed the first transatlantic telegraph cable. He, by then, was well in his 70s. But this five-person commission put out a really fascinating scientific report that in many ways is very modern once you get past the start where it says, "Because your majesty has graciously granted us leave to report." 1903 was his final report. The commission developed analytical methods for arsenic that had a detection limit of 36 parts per billion in beer. And then had the job of, they traced the causes, and then they had the job of recommending what the law should be. And they recognized they had a problem. They knew what the acute effects were of consuming arsenic, but they didn't know what the chronic effects of lower levels would be. And here's what Lord Kelvin's commission said about that, concluded about that. They said, "In the absence of fuller knowledge as to the possible effect of consumption of mere traces of arsenic, we are not prepared to allow that it would be right to declare any quantity of arsenic, however small, as admissible in beer or in any food." This is the precautionary principle that we are still debating today. Now, their recommendation was that the manufacturers should strive to eliminate all arsenic. They recognized that if they had even more sensitive analytical methods, they would be able to detect something naturally present, and they disposed of that argument with more or less the same reasoning people use today. They set a goal of no detectable arsenic in food and a enforceable limit based on what they thought could be routinely analyzed and enforced of 100 parts per billion in liquid food and 1 part per million in solid food. This became the law in England and spread to most of Europe. Now, in the United States at the same time, arsenic also came to the fore as a pollutant, but it came to the fore in a different way. It came out of lawsuits against copper smelters. The first lawsuit was in Ducktown, Tennessee, where the trees were getting killed in Georgia. So the state of Georgia sued Tennessee. Most of the copper smelters were in the West, and the big case came in Anaconda, Montana. Teddy Roosevelt, who was a very hands-on president, hired the lawyer who had won the Ducktown case to handle this case for the government. He was in constant contact with the Attorney General, even checking on how they were doing on getting expert witnesses. The Attorney General actually reported to the President on that. The case was settled after Taft became President by appointing a commission. The commission eventually decided, after a few years, came more and more under the sway of Anaconda. And after about 4 or 5 years, they accepted Anaconda's view that the pollution should only be cleaned up to the extent that they could make money doing so. Now, by then, the scientists had found, actually expert witnesses hired by the plaintiffs had determined that there was lead and arsenic, mostly arsenic, along with the sulfur that was causing the problems from the smelters. And one of the plaintiff's experts was Robert Swain, who later became head of the chemistry department at Stanford and even president of the university. However, in these lawsuits, many other lawsuits were filed by private parties, and the American judges set the principle that they would only restrain the emissions if you could prove that they were causing damage. Basically, the principle set in American law was that chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. Now, that principle was sort of imported from the law into science in the 1920s. When leaded gasoline was introduced, there was a large dispute over leaded gasoline, which I have the details of in my book, and the control of the science of lead, toxicology of lead, came under the control of a professor by the name of Robert Kehoe, who was also a professor at the University of Cincinnati and also chief medical officer of the Ethel Corporation, which was the manufacturer. And he was someone who was, I have to say, sincerely mistaken about the chronic effects of lead, but he, due to his selection by industry and sponsorship by industry, he had basically a monopoly of the science through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And his view was that the known economic benefits of a chemical always outweigh unknown health effects. Again, it was chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. Now, he thought that lead was harmless below a certain threshold, and that when he saw industry going above that threshold, he would, behind the scenes, really come down hard on them. I mean, he, as I say, he was sincerely deluded about this. Well, these two approaches to regulating chemicals collided very soon. In 1925, people in England became sick from eating American apples. The British government threatened to ban all imports of American fruit unless the U.S. government started enforcing Lord Kelvin's limit. So the apple growers initially voluntarily agreed to this because they didn't want to lose the British market. And they set up an inspection system. How do I get the next? They set up an inspection system with the brand new Food and Drug Administration, which actually got its name only in 1927. At first, they allowed higher levels of arsenic on apples that were going to be eaten in the United States than for export. That was not politically tenable even in the Hoover administration. And by 1932, they were enforcing the Lord Kelvin's number of 1 part per million on all fruit. Now the apple growers started to resist. And they had some powerful weapons because, first of all, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 authorized the FDA to seize unwholesome food, but it did not authorize the FDA to issue any regulations defining what was unwholesome. So if the fruit was seized, the defendant could challenge the science in court every time, and the juries in the apple-growing regions tended to side with the farmers. So the FDA started a big, big experiment to try to determine. They had the further problem. They didn't know. They were still unknown as to the chronic effects. They only knew the acute effects of arsenic. So they started a large, I'd say even by today's standards, very large rat feeding experiment. This was received with displeasure by the chairman of the House Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee, who was an apple farmer himself. And he put a rider on the 1938 appropriations bill that made them stop the experiment in the middle. They had to kill 5,000 rats at the end of the fiscal year with the experiment unfinished. Congressman Cannon, the subcommittee chairman, was introduced by a man named Felix Wurmser, who was the chief lobbyist for the Lead Industries Association, and appears in some other books for his efforts to prevent newspapers from warning parents not to use lead paint on cribs. Mr. Wurmser introduced him to a scientist at the Public Health Service by the name of Roy Sayers, who was the head of the Industrial Hygiene Division. Dr. Sayers' previous accomplishments included, he did the study saying leaded gasoline was safe after it was temporarily banned in 1925. And then somebody who worked for him discovered black lung disease, and he refused to allow the report to be published. Dr. Sayers, on his government salary, had bought this house, which is not just any big house. It's the house where Robert E. Lee grew up, and George Washington was a frequent dinner guest. And we found the deed. He paid $10 down, according to the deed, for this house. So Dr. Sayers got the budget that had been taken away from the FDA and arranged the protocol in advance with the subcommittee chairman for his research. The upshot of his research was that and it was pretty clearly biased. He, by several methods, selected a biased sample, and he looked at active apple pickers to see if they had symptoms of lead or arsenic poisoning. The study was carried out by a subordinate of his named Paul Neal, and they recommended doubling and tripling of the allowable human intake of lead and arsenic. The FDA reacted to this with utter horror. They had an advisory committee who told them that this study is worthless. So there was a showdown meeting between the FDA and the Industrial Hygiene Division in the office of what would now be the Secretary of HHS, who was the former governor of Indiana. The FDA folks said this study can't be right because we know that lead is more toxic than this from other studies. And Dr. Neal said, well, maybe lead becomes less toxic when you combine it with arsenic. And needless to say, the Governor McNutt sided with the, no doubt thinking about that the former subcommittee chairman was now the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, decided to approve the increase in the allowable intake of lead and arsenic. Now, meanwhile, there was a second thing going on to strengthen the FDA's authority, and that was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. That was proposed by Rex Tugwell, who was one of President Roosevelt's chief advisors and was Assistant Secretary of Agriculture. And as originally proposed, that would give the FDA authority to set standards that would be enforceable in court. Well, as finally passed, it was something that set a pattern, I think, for a lot of laws since. It allowed them to set standards that would be enforceable, but it put a very high burden of proof and a whole long series of administrative procedures that made it in practice nearly impossible to set a standard. And the upshot was that within 10 years after the law was passed, only one standard for fluoride had been approved. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was 38. Yeah. So then the Second World War starts, and as we all know, DDT was developed during the war as a pesticide. Now, as we may not all know, there were many doubts about it raised from the very beginning. NIH and the FDA were very concerned about the human health effects. The Agriculture Department, Bureau of Entomology, was very concerned about the environmental effects. DDT actually, towards the end of the war, the Army and Agriculture Department jointly issued an order that essentially banned all civilian spraying with DDT on the grounds that it was a threat to the balance of nature. That was in April 1945. The problem was that the only legal authority they had to enforce this ban was the rationing in wartime. So once the war ended, they had no legal authority. The chemical companies rushed, it had been very widely publicized during the war. The chemical companies, rushed into the business, although some of the larger ones apparently held back at first. They were worried about liability, but it was clearly such a big business that everybody jumped in. At this point, everyone recognized the Insecticide Act of 1910, which was the law then on the books, was out of date. The head of the insecticide division at Agriculture Department, which had been taken out of, it had been part of FDA, but was separated from FDA when FDA was moved out of agriculture in 1939. He wanted to have a system of registration and controls on advertising, but he made the calculation that nothing would ever pass Congress unless it was supported by the industry. And I have to say from all my research that his calculation was absolutely correct. So they introduced FIFRA. And they set up, that's where pesticide registration was first introduced. The 1910 Act was purely a labeling act. It had no safety provisions at all. FIFRA, you had to register, and there was no registration. You just sold it, and if you sold something that didn't work as advertised, you could get in trouble. Under FIFRA, you had to submit your pesticide in advance and provide evidence that it was safe for the user, not for the public or the environment, but you did have to show it was safe for the user. And you couldn't, and as originally proposed, you couldn't sell it until it was registered. As passed, they added something called registration under protest, which was that if the Agriculture Department refused to register your pesticide, you could still sell it, and you just called it registration under protest. This continued to be, the pesticides continued to be an issue well through the 1950s, a prominent issue in the 1950s. In 1957, the Delaney Clause was passed, which was slipped into the bill, sort of the mirror image of what had happened with the study in 1936. Congressman Delaney from New York, who was a strong advocate of pesticide regulation, was on the Rules Committee, and he slipped this clause into a bill that at a point late in the process where it was very hard to take out, into a bill that people wanted passed, and the full implications of it weren't understood, but it banned the presence of any detectable carcinogen in processed food. A year later, a carcinogenic pesticide was detected in cranberries just before Thanksgiving, and the entire cranberry crop was seized. And this tremendously, of course, brought pesticide safety into the public eye. 3 years after that is the publication of Silent Spring, which I think it's important to remember something, that Silent Spring did not have any new science in it. Silent Spring summarized the science of the 40s and 50s. All of that research had been done, published in journals. The people doing it understood the implications. Rachel Carson was a tremendously gifted writer and, a very good popularizer of science. And what she did was she brought together the science, and she also put it into a framework of a worldview in which it was not simply a local threat, but a threat to our whole environment of the world. And Silent Spring had a tremendous impact. It sold 500,000 copies within about 6 months. There was an hour-long TV special on CBS about it. President Kennedy asked the President's Science Advisory Committee to do a study of the issue. And the President's Science Advisory Committee basically said Rachel Carson was right. However, the manufacturers still had really an iron grip on Congress. And there was very little change in pesticide law through the 60s at the national level. By the late 60s, there was increasing public concern about all aspects of the environment. Cities and counties started to pass local bans on DDT. There was then a series of really prominent environmental disasters. Oil well blowout off of Santa Barbara. Most of the Great Lakes a large part of the Great Lakes was closed to fishing because of mercury pollution. There was widely publicized, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught on fire. And all of this came together in April 1970 in the first Earth Day. That is Fifth Avenue in New York on the first Earth Day. This caused a tremendous amount of public and political pressure on President Nixon and within Congress. President Nixon actually had come into office with obviously a promise to the chemical manufacturers to clip the wings of the FDA. And he appointed a head of the FDA who was much more pro-industry. At the same time, though, once this happened, he was under great political pressure and especially worried because he was expecting to run for president next time against Senator Muskie, who was the main sponsor of the environmental legislation. So the Clean Air Act was passed with its tremendously strong provisions of no balancing tests between cost and benefit. You just have to clean it up in the law, according to the law, not in reality as it's administered, but according to the law without regard for the cost as long as it's feasible. And that was signed by Nixon. In 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed by Congress with similar provisions. Also very important citizen suit provisions were there. By the time the Clean Water Act was passed by Congress, Nixon was running against McGovern and knew he was going to win in a landslide. So after Congress adjourned, he vetoed it, but Congress stayed in session and overrode the veto. in the middle of October, right before the election. The third of this trio of laws was the revision of FIFRA, which the real wonks call FEPCA, in 1972. That was much more of a compromise. Senator Muskie did succeed in getting jurisdiction taken out of the Agriculture Committee and shared with his committee, and that it undoubtedly would have been much weaker otherwise. But the bill is finally passed, was a compromise with the balancing of economic benefit versus health, and and that was signed by Nixon. Now, to complete this was the environmental legislation continued through the 70s. One that people here will be particularly care about is TSCA of 1976. This continued. This was triggered by discoveries of PCBs all over the world, and that was initially supposed to bring the precautionary principle into American law and require pre-testing of chemicals. This was watered down in endless negotiations between industry, environmental lobbyists, and other interest groups. And eventually its passed was so watered down that it really didn't accomplish anything other than the ban on PCBs. Now, one of the reasons, it turns out, the environmental lobbyists did this was that working its way through Congress at the same time was RCRA, which was advertised as a bill to require deposits on bottles. The industry lobbyists never noticed that it had the hazardous waste provisions in it. And the environmental lobbyists wanted to keep the industry lobbyists busy. And so they kept making concessions on TSCA. So now, 25 years past TSCA, 35 years past TSCA, we have a much worse problem of chemicals coming into the environment. We have drugs, we have endocrine disruptors, we have perfluorinated and perbrominated organics, which are flame retardants and so on, which are another enormous problem. Plasticizers, and the things that I particularly have been worried about is surfactants and solubilizers. All of those are more and more pervading our environment, and so now we have this same problem in front of us in the Safer Chemicals Act, which I'm sure other people have talked about and will continue to talk about. Now, what are the lessons of all this? These stories sound bad, and these stories are bad, but I draw a somewhat optimistic lesson. A couple of optimistic lessons. First, the scientific community does have means of bringing out the truth. The truth does bubble up. There's Rachel Carson's popularizing that science of the 50s. There's the discovery by someone doing completely different research of lead, disproving the belief that lead was safe at low levels. And second, I don't believe that regulation doesn't work. There's a theory out there called cognitive regulatory capture, that regulators are always automatically captured mentally by the people they're supposed to be regulating. And what the environmental history shows is that that's not why regulators get captured. They get captured by the direct application of political and economic pressure. And that what's needed is counter-pressure and mobilization and organization, and the public pressure is the key. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions.
Sure.
We have questions? Mike is coming.
You said that they had kind of like a stick because they said it was the threat to the balance of nature. Why can't we use that stick now?
Well, that is what we're saying now, I think. That's what people are what they meant by that, they meant by that the same thing that people talk about now about pesticides disrupting food chains and so on. That's what they meant by it. You know, loss of predators would unbalance ecology. That's what they meant by that.
They got results by using that argument.
Yeah, they got results very temporarily. They got results for about 4 months. And a lot of the reason is that they had, you know, during the, you know, you're talking about the Roosevelt administration, you're talking about the Second World War, the Army talked to the people. Well, one thing is that the Agriculture Department, entomologists in the 30s and early 40s took a very different view from what they did later. And that the Agriculture Department people who had developed DDT were very concerned about its ecological effects. So the Army, during the Second World War, they went for the best advice, and they got what they thought was the best advice. And, you know, the Agriculture Department and FDA and the NIH were all telling them to be cautious with this stuff. They had already had a couple of disasters where they had experimentally sprayed DDT on ecosystems and seen devastation. And so, you know, during the Second World War, the Army said, this is it, and that was it. I mean, I think that's really the explanation of that. It's, you know, it's the political mood in the country, too. Someone else? Yeah.
Do polluters' contributions to campaign finance funds significantly influence legislation, in your opinion?
Well, I think the answer, you know, not as a, I mean, in this book, we, I don't think we saw much in the way of campaign contributions. I mean, there was, well, yeah, I mean, the Roosevelts, I mean, the DuPont family financed 7% of the Republican campaign in 1936 by itself. You know, and obviously that had an influence. You know, everyone knows that there's some influence there. I mean, I have the same practical experience of that as anybody else.
All the way in the back. Track star is coming.
Can you explain what the two elements that you're most concerned about, you mentioned that very briefly, are?
Well, this is my personal, I'm not sure that it's the thing that you should be most concerned about, but the thing that I personally ran into 15, 20 years ago and have been, and feel that it's particularly, well, something that I think is generally underrated as a problem is water-soluble contaminants, hydrophilic contaminants, because the EPA's analytical methods are geared towards detecting hydrophobic contaminants. So things that are hydrophilic tend very much to pass under the radar screen. Glycol ethers are an example. And drugs are another example of that process.
So what do you think are some of the biggest barriers to more government involvement and regulation over a lot of these different chemicals? In the example of the EPA, is it a resource issue? Do they not have the resources or the staff to do this? And then what are some of your prescriptions for some of these barriers?
Well, EPA is definitely short of staff, and state agencies generally are even more short of staff. And the remedy is public pressure. There's no other remedy. And I'll also say that leadership is important. A lot of individuals, made decisions. Congressman Delaney made a different decision from Congressman Cannon, and they both had a big influence. And I can point to people within industry who were working very hard to get things cleaned up. And it is, but the key thing is public pressure.
And if you've been to Washington to lobby, you know that there is a office building named after Representative Cannon, and there isn't one named after Representative Delaney.
It's a different Cannon.
Oh, well, it was a good
Different
story.
Cannon.
We don't want to let the facts get in the way.
Drug Administration used to be called the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration?
That's right. That was the original name. The name was changed in the 30s, but actually the insecticide, it was part of the Agriculture Department, and the insecticide stayed within it until 1939. In 1939, they set up the Federal Security Agency, which evolved into HHS. And when they set that up, they took Social Security out of wherever it had been. They took the Public Health Service that had been in the Treasury Department up to then. And they took the FDA out of the Agriculture Department. But when they took the FDA out of the Agriculture Department, they left the insecticides in the Agriculture Department. If I could just add to that, the original, part of the history of that is the original name was the Bureau of Chemistry of the Agriculture Department. And then that was also, I think, included the soil testing parts of the Agriculture Department, anything that was chemistry, testing food, testing chemistry, testing soil, whatever. And in 27 or 28, they split that and made the FDA a separate agency.
Obviously, there's a lot of interest in Monsanto, which is a metaphor for all the big chemical companies. But how have those companies changed the culture of the companies that you have talked about so far in the way our government operates and so on?
Well, I think, the question of company culture is very interesting. And it's not a black and white story at all. One of the things that's most interesting is that I'm convinced that the leaders in DuPont in the 30s were very much, in fact, wanted to clean up their emissions. However, they were very ideologically opposed to any kind of federal regulation, and based really on a political philosophy, not on their direct economic interest. And the way DuPont was already a very large and diverse company, and to be able to run itself efficiently, they were decentralized. The managers of the divisions were judged on their profits. So the central management actually wanted the divisions to do better and had a staff that was pushing them, but couldn't get them always to do what they wanted. And the way DuPont was set up, new plants were built by the central staff. And so they actually had a higher level of environmental protection in the new plants built by DuPont in the 50s than they could get their divisions to do in the existing plants. So it's a complicated story. And you can make a pretty strong argument that DuPont's opposition to federal regulation in this period was actually against their economic interest, because it enabled, they did have a higher standard in some cases than other companies, and other companies could outcompete them.
I know about 20-some years ago, after the Bhopal incident in India, there was a Community Right to Know Act, and there was toxic release inventory data that it was published in the newspaper here every year because companies voluntarily had to submit the info, but at least it was publicized, and it was a big motivator for a lot of communities to see what was going on. And then it just seems like that's vanished. You never hear about it anymore. Do you have any info
No, it's still
about
out
that?
there. They still have to report that. That's not voluntary. They're required to file those reports.
Right, but I
And
mean,
it's still all online.
they report their own emissions.
Yeah.
But you never see it anywhere at all in the media. I never hear anything about community right to know or toxic release inventory. It just seems to have, as anybody else in any other part of the country, it's not for 20 years anyway.
I know I've used those data in the last few years occasionally.
I think some of the publication of that went away after 9/11, and an emphasis on security, and so it may still be available, but I don't think it's readily published. We have time maybe for one more question. Here's one down here.
What more should we know about beryllium and the fiasco that started it?
What's the question?
What more should we know about beryllium?
I'm not a toxicologist. I don't. The history of how the beryllium standard was originally set is in David Michael's book. What's the title? Doubt is their product.
I want to thank Ben very much. The thing which he mentioned, that's one of the things that struck me in reading the book about the arsenic that came out of the copper smelters. They then made that into a pesticide, really, created markets for it. For a while, the copper people were the largest purveyor of arsenic for pesticides. So it's sort of an ironic thing that continues in the sense that if you're a manufacturer who produces something that may be hazardous, but if it becomes somebody else's input, raw material, then it's not hazardous waste. And this is another part of this, chemicals getting the benefit of the doubt. Thank you.